a grand welcome back to winning paths, where after a wee pause we return with tales spun from the myths and legends of far-flung corners of the world. Today we journey first to the mist-shrouded lands of Japan, where a story brimming with wonder and whispers of destiny awaits. And then, as is our custom, we'll bring you home to Ireland's green heart with a yarn of no less charm, told in that old familiar way, steeped in wit, warmth, and a touch of the poetic, as only old storytelling can be. It begins, not with the twang of a bowstring or the soft shuffle of silk robes in moonlit corridors, but with a storm, an imperial storm, its winds sharp with betrayal and thunderous with ambition. The Heian era was a delicate poem, a tapestry unraveling at the edges, each frayed thread a courtier's intrigue or a samurai's blade. Amid this delicate chaos, in a world as fragile as the rice-paper walls of its palaces, was born Minamoto no Tametomo, a man whose legend, like his arrows, would fly straight, swift, and pierce the very heart of time. Tametomo's story begins, as many such tales do, with an omen. His birth was not a quiet affair. The gods, it seemed, had taken a particular interest in him. The midwives whispered of his left arm, longer than his right, unnaturally so, a grotesquerie to some, and a mark of divine favor to others. This disproportion, they murmured, could only mean one thing: destiny. And destiny, as any student of history or mythology will tell you, is rarely kind. His mother, a woman of quiet dignity, might have seen it as a blessing. His father, Minamoto no Tamayoshi, saw it as a complication. From the beginning, Tametomo was both a marvel and a burden to his family. The Minamoto clan was a pillar of the imperial court, bound to the throne by duty and ambition, yet always teetering on the edge of rebellion. His father, ever the pragmatic tactician, no doubt viewed his son's unusual physique with both pride and unease. That long left arm, you see, gave Tametomo a unique advantage with the bow. As he grew, it became clear that his deformity, or gift, depending on one's perspective, was less a curse and more a declaration. With every shot he loosed, Tametomo proclaimed his singularity, his defiance of nature's symmetry, and perhaps, in some small way, his defiance of the court itself. By the time he was a young man, Tametomo's reputation had grown larger than the man himself. The court whispered of his skill, his arrogance, and his hunger for battle. He was not the sort to linger in gardens or pen wistful poetry about cherry blossoms. He was a creature of action, of sinew and steel, a man who measured his worth not in words, but in victories. He was a samurai in the purest sense of the word, a warrior whose life was tied to the bow and the blade as tightly as the string to his yumi. The trouble with being exceptional, of course, is that it rarely wins you friends. Tametomo's prowess made him a symbol, a rallying point for those who chafed under imperial rule. The Taira clan, rivals to the Minamoto and equal masters of ambition, saw in him a threat. And so, as the winds of war began to stir, Tametomo found himself thrust into a conflict not of his making. The Hogan Rebellion, they called it, though to Tametomo it was simply survival. The Minamoto, outmaneuvered and outnumbered, fell to the Taira's cunning. Tamayoshi, his father, was executed, and Tametomo, that indomitable archer, was captured. Here, in chains and humiliation, one might expect Tametomo's story to end. But legends, like stubborn weeds, often thrive in adversity. The Taira, recognizing his skill and fearing his influence, chose exile over execution. They sent him to the remote islands of Oshima, a place as far from the imperial court as one could imagine. It was, they thought, a fate worse than death for a man like Tametomo, a warrior stripped of his battlefield, a hawk caged and defanged. Yet, exile did not break him. It merely transformed him. Oshima was no courtly paradise. It was wild, rugged, a place where the sea crashed against jagged cliffs with a fury that mirrored Tametomo's own. Here, far from the whispers of courtiers and the machinations of rival clans, Tametomo found a kind of brutal clarity. He trained, honed his skills, and waited. And as he waited, his legend grew. The islands were home to outcasts and fishermen, men who had little use for imperial decrees, and even less for samurai honor. To them, Tametomo was a hero, a symbol of defiance against the distant and indifferent powers that ruled their lives. The stories of Tametomo's time on Oshima are as wild and untamed as the man himself. They say he defended the island from pirates, his arrows striking with unerring precision even in the chaos of battle. They say he could shoot an arrow through the mast of a ship from the cliffs, his bow singing like a storm's prelude. They say he became a king, a leader of the island's people, though whether they crowned him or he simply took the title by force is a matter of debate. What is certain is that Tametomo thrived in exile, his spirit unbroken, his defiance unyielding. But the gods, as ever, had other plans. Tametomo's peace, if one could call it that, was not to last. The court, wary of his growing influence and fearful of rebellion, sent an armada to deal with him. It was an overreaction, perhaps, but then, the court had always been good at those. The ships came, their sails bright against the grey horizon, their decks bristling with warriors. They came not to negotiate, but to crush him. Tametomo, for his part, did not cower. He did not plead, he did not surrender. Instead, he stood on the cliffs of Oshima, his bow in hand, and faced the armada with the calm of a man who had already died once and had no intention of doing so again. The battle that followed was as much myth as history, a tableau of chaos and courage, painted in blood and salt spray. Tametomo's arrows flew swift and true, each shot a declaration of defiance, a challenge to the gods and men who sought to end him. The stories say he sank ships with his arrows, that his shots were so powerful they pierced the hulls and sent entire vessels to the depths. It is, of course, an exaggeration, but only just. What is undeniable is that Tametomo fought with a ferocity that shook even his enemies. He held the cliffs against overwhelming odds, his lone figure a monument to the stubbornness of the human spirit. In the end, though, even legends have their limits. Tametomo's arrows ran out, his strength waned, and the armada pressed on. The island was overrun, its defenders scattered, but Tametomo did not fall to an enemy's blade. No, his end was as singular as his life. Faced with capture, with the humiliation of being paraded before the court as a defeated rebel, Tametomo chose his own fate. He drove his sword into his stomach with such force that the blade pierced through his back and lodged in the ground beneath him. It was a death as deliberate and precise as his arrows, a final act of defiance against the world that had sought to break him. But Tametomo's story does not end with his death. Legends, after all, are not bound by the constraints of flesh and bone. They say his spirit lingers, watching over the islands he once defended. They say his bow, unbroken and waiting, rests in a hidden cave, a relic of a time when one man's defiance could shake an empire. They say his bloodline lives on, his descendants inheriting his skill with the bow and his unyielding spirit. Perhaps it is fitting that Tametomo's legacy is as contradictory as the man himself. He was a rebel and a hero, a warrior and a king, a man whose strength lay not only in his arm, but in his refusal to bend to the will of others. He was, in the end, a man who chose his own path, no matter how difficult or dangerous, and walked it with the steady, unerring grace of an arrow loosed toward its mark. And so, as the winds of history scatter the ashes of empires and the whispers of legends fade into the quiet hum of the present, Minamoto no Tametomo remains, not as a man perhaps, but as a story of defiance and precision, of strength and solitude, of a life lived not in service to the whims of others, but to the unyielding pull of one's own bowstring. And now let us wander from the enigmatic beauty of Japan to Ireland, a land no less steeped in mystery and allure. Like everywhere else, Ireland has its places, some well-trodden and others shrouded in obscurity, with a few glowing under the harsh dazzle of the world's spotlight. But Ballyragget was never the kind of place that inscribed its stories in ink. No, its legends were etched into the gnarled bark of its leaning hawthorn trees, or carried in the wind that slipped slyly through the hedgerows. It was a town where the everyday rubbed shoulders with the strange, where the rhythm of life was as steady and as unpredictable as a drunkard's gait. And it was here, in this damp and unassuming corner of Ireland, that Imoon Ní Flannagáin carved her mark, not with quill and parchment, but with reeds and rust. Imoon, the girl with the sharp eyes and the sharper silences, was an oddity in a village that prided itself on its eccentricities. She moved like she was afraid to disturb the air around her, but there was steel in her slender frame, the kind that didn't bend even when the wind howled fiercest. Her name, Imoon, wasn't one the priest could bless with any enthusiasm. He muttered about it being pagan nonsense, some leftover syllable from the Tuatha De Danann, but her father wore it proudly, claiming it was older than the hills themselves. Her mother, though, wasn't as poetic. An odd name for an odd child, she'd mutter, though there was a note of pride hidden in her grumbling. Now, if her name raised eyebrows, her bow raised them higher, a contraption cobbled together from driftwood, fishing line, and sheer determination. It looked like it might snap if you so much as breathed near it, but in Imoon's hands it was a thing of precision and poetry. She could shoot a reed clean through a knot in the barn door, and more than once she'd sent the village lads scattering with a well-aimed shot to their pride. Her favorite target, though, was a battered old bucket her father had hung on the fence. Thunk, thunk, thunk went her reeds against its rusty surface, a rhythm that echoed through the fields like the ticking of some ancient, patient clock. Not everyone in Ballyragget admired her skill. The biddies at the church gate clucked their tongues and crossed themselves whenever they saw her with her bow slung across her back. "It's not natural," muttered Mora O'Hanlon, whose opinions were as gnarled as her fingers. "Girls weren't meant for bows. Next, she'll be riding into battle, God save us." Peig O'Dwyer, her eternal rival, sniffed in agreement. "Mark my words, that girl's headed for trouble. There's something cursed about her." Mora and Peig were as much a part of Ballyragget as the rain and the gossip. Their feud, rooted in some long-forgotten slight, had grown into a daily ritual of shouted insults and flying projectiles. A broken egg here, a lobbed potato there. Some days it was a wonder neither of them had ended up skewered like one of Imoon's targets. It was a morning like any other when Bramble, Peig's shaggy and perpetually scheming horse, decided to add his own chaos to the village's symphony of grievances. He'd slipped out of his paddock with the cunning of a rogue and made a beeline for Mora's garden, where her cabbages sat in tidy rows like emerald sentinels. With a snort of triumph, he plunged his muzzle into the nearest head of cabbage, ripping it apart with all the finesse of a drunken poet tearing up a rejection letter. "Imoon! Bramble's in the cabbages!" Her mother's voice rang out from the kitchen, half panic, half exasperation. "For the love of God, stop him before Mora comes out with her broom." Imoon didn't need telling twice. Grabbing her bow and a handful of reeds, she darted into the field, her bare feet finding the soft, damp earth with a practiced ease. Bramble, oblivious to the chaos he was about to unleash, was halfway through his third cabbage when Imoon loosed her first reed. It struck the ground just in front of his hooves, sending him prancing backward with an indignant snort. "Easy, you lump," Imoon muttered, knocking another reed. But Bramble, being Bramble, decided the grass was greener and safer on the other side of Mora's wall. With a mighty leap, he cleared it, landing in the cabbage patch just as Mora herself appeared, broom in hand and fury in her eyes. "What in the name of St. Bridget, my cabbages?" Mora's shriek could have woken the dead. She charged at Bramble, swinging her broom like a soldier wielding a pike. Peig, drawn by the commotion, arrived just in time to see her horse receive a clout to the rump. "Touch my Bramble again, and I'll—" "You'll what?" Mora spat back, planting herself between the horse and her decimated cabbages. "Sue me for defending me livelihood." "Your livelihood? You couldn't sell those cabbages if they were dipped in gold," Peig shot back, brandishing her own broom like a rival knight. Amid the cacophony, Imoon loosed another reed, grazing Bramble's flank just enough to send him trotting back to Peig's yard with a reproachful toss of his mane. She slipped away before either woman could turn their wrath on her, her bow slung across her back and a grin tugging at the corners of her mouth. But Ballyragget being Ballyragget, the story didn't end there. Word of Imoon's quick thinking spread through the village, carried on the tide of gossip that flowed stronger than the River Nor. Soon enough, she found herself the subject of admiration and suspicion in equal measure. The lads at the pub began wagering on her aim, while Father O'Malley muttered darkly about pride coming before a fall. Then came the letter. It arrived on a misty morning, its fine parchment and ornate seal a sharp contrast to the rough hands of the postman who delivered it. Addressed to Miss Imoon Ní Flannagáin, it was an invitation to an archery competition in Kilkenny. The prize, £20, a sum so grand it might as well have been a king's ransom. Imoon's father nearly dropped his tea when he read it aloud. £20? Sure, you could buy half of Ballyragget with that. Her mother, ever the practical one, frowned. It's a long way to Kilkenny, and what would a girl like her be doing competing against grown men? But Imoon, her hands steady despite the trembling in her heart, said simply, I'll go. And so, on a rare sunny morning, Imoon found herself standing on the green in Kilkenny, her patched dress and driftwood bow, a stark contrast to the polished weapons and fine silks of her competitors. She felt their eyes on her, the weight of their scornful amusement, but she stood firm, her chin lifted and her grip steady. When her turn came, she stepped forward, her heart thudding like a drum. The target, a painted bullseye far in the distance, seemed to waver in the sunlight, but she didn't falter. Drawing her bowstring back with that same quiet determination that had seen her through years of whispers and ridicule, she loosed her reed. It flew straight and true, striking the center with a thunk that silenced the crowd. By the end of the day, Imoon had won the competition, the purse, and the respect of a crowd that had doubted her. But it wasn't the money or the applause that mattered. As she walked back to Ballyragget, the new bow slung over her shoulder, and her prize tucked safely under her arm, she felt something settle in her chest. Not pride exactly, but a quiet certainty, a knowledge that she had carved out a place for herself, not just in the village but in the world. When she arrived home, Mora and Pei were still at it, their brooms clashing like medieval swords. She smiled to herself, the weight of her new bow reassuring against her back. Ballyragget, with all its peculiarities and petty feuds, might not change, but she had, and for now, that was enough. And so, we reached the end, tracing the flight of two arrows loosed across the uncertain expanse of time and place, one soaring from the storm-lashed cliffs of Oshima, the other arcing from the wind-scoured fields of Ballyragget. Minamoto no Tametomo, a figure chiseled from legend and rebellion, defied the currents of empires with a bowstring taut as fate itself. Imoon Ní Flannagáin, with her driftwood bow and unyielding spirit, found her mark not in the annals of kings, but in the stubborn soil of a village that scarcely knew what to make of her. And yet, in their trajectories, there's a kinship, a quiet defiance shared between the roar of battles and the rustle of hedgerows. One stood against the weight of history, his arrow stitching rebellion into the fabric of an empire. The other aimed amid squabbles and gossip, her story carried not by chroniclers, but by the restless Irish wind. Both remind us that greatness, whether grand or humble, isn't measured in applause. It's the courage to draw the bow at all, knowing the string might snap or the target shift before the arrow ever lands. Legends, whether carved in imperial steel or whispered through sodden fields, are less about the size of their stages and more about the hearts that propel them. Be they the tamers of destiny or the renegades of small-town skirmishes, the true measure of an archer isn't the precision of their aim, but the resolve to stand steady when the moment calls.